Hi, I'm Chef Joe with Outdoor Solutions, and on this week's Smart Tips and Tricks, we're going to break down this deer from skinning it all the way down, quartering it, and cutting it up for the freezer. All right, so now we've got our animal broke down. We have our ribs, we've got our back strap, our tenderloins, our front shoulders, and our hindquarters. So we're going to finish breaking this down, and then we're going to start going into our primal cuts and we'll talk about what's tender, what's semi-tender. This part, preparation, is just like thinking ahead and setting your camp up to hunt. You know, you got to get your, what do you want in your camp? Your sleeping facilities, tent, trailer, whatever, your hunting gear, food sources, all of that. So at this stage, you want to have what you're going to need to do this. And you need a clean surface and a surface that you can wipe down as you're doing this. In any kitchen, any chef, you clean as you go. And it's the same way when you're breaking down this animal. We keep cleaning, we keep cleaning. We've got the hair off, we've still got some hair, we've got some fascia and silver skin we're going to remove. So you want to have your knives, everything clean and ready to go. Have a clean tub to put that finished meat into. For me, a rule of thumb is if I'm going to cut it and push it to the side of the plate because I don't want to eat it, then I'm not going to serve it. So we're going to start with this hindquarter, and we've already split our pelvic bone on it. So again, we're just going to work that down. And there's a bone socket here. We're going to work and find that, which is right here. So now we're just going to let the weight of this leg help us break it apart from the pelvic area. And we're just going to keep working that. There we go. All right. And we've got one off of there. On this here, where the socket and the leg was connected to it, and then as we follow that bone down, the important part here is to follow the concave of this bone. And a lot of times people cut they come straight across like that, and so you're losing a really good piece of meat that's the most tender part. All right. So now we can really start breaking this into our primal cuts here. So, as we're working along here, you can see how this is starting to glaze up. You want to look and make sure you're getting any of the loose hairs and things off as we're trimming this. Look for any bloodshot, bone fragment, things like that you just don't want to bite into or eat. So when you're breaking these down and cutting them down, you have maps, you have seams where everything's connected on these. There's different schools of thought on leaving some of this silver skin and fascia on versus taking it all off right now. And part of that is if you're freezing some of this meat and stuff, it helps protect it, and if it gets a little freezer burn, you can trim it off at that point. I like to cut it off and trim it. It gives me a better access to the seams of what I want to cut. And you know, like on here, if I have any loose hairs or anything that I haven't been able to wipe off, I'm trimming that off right now. So the fat that is on a deer, an elk, antelope is a lot different than the fat on beef. And the beef fat marbles. So this is actually a tallow. It gets rancid over time. So that's why we always trim. And when people talk about that gamey taste, this is what they're talking about when people leave the tallow on the meat. There's a few exceptions. Your ribs are one of them because you're eating this quick. The longer it sets, the more rancid tallow becomes. So you want to eat these fairly soon. So other than that, we're going to trim, and we want to get rid of all this fat and all this silver skin off of these things. All right, so now we're going to start breaking this hind quarter down. So, and there's no rhyme or reason in where you start. It's just you want to grab a seam and start cutting. So this is the top round that we're working on right here. You want to make, you can use roast, you can make this into a steak. It's tender. Bottom round here is also got the eye, or some people call it the mock tender, because it kind of will look like the tenderloin when we're done. It's a semi tender cut. One of the ways you can tell too is on your bottom round, the grain runs parallel to the cut, and with your or your top round, the grain runs the length of the cut, and then this is the part of the top of the round on that. So now we've got the sirloin. Oops, here's our sirloin tip right here. So this is on the outside, and this is actually what you would call the tri-tip, so on a beef. So and this is part of that right here, and this is the top of the sirloin. And then this is what I call a football, because it kind of has the shape of the football. One of those cuts where you could leave this whole as a roast. This has a lot of tendon that runs through it, so that's what makes it a tougher cut. If you wanted to live that as a roast and slow cook it, you certainly can do that. And then we have the shank, and this is a tough cut of meat. It's the toughest cut on the animal, but it has the most flavor, and it has an awful lot of tendon in it, and so that tendon is what you want to really cook slow, so it breaks down, and that's why we use it in stew and things like that. When I bone them out, I leave the hock, this part up here, attached to it too. Then if you're into making your bone broth or beef broth, you're going to want to use these legs. But when you do that, when you're making your beef broth, always just use the round bone. Don't use the flat bone. The round has the bone marrow in it, and that's where you have the flavor. And the other flatter bones and things like that, it's not going to give you the flavors that you want. So, all right, so then that's your tough cut. So, and then this is the bone that you'd want to use for making beef broth and stuff. That's what we have for the back leg. So you have your bottom round, top round, your eye, your sirloin tip, and your sirloin roast, or your steak. And right there, that's how I break down a hind quarter. That's how we do that. So now if we want to do a front shoulder, again, we have some options here. We're going to trim and clean it just like we did the hind quarter. There's basically one good tender cut on the front shoulder, and that's the what they call the flat iron steak if it were on a deer, or on a beef. And on a deer, it's a pretty small cut. So it has a tendon that runs through it, and my preference when I'm doing a shoulder is I trim this up as we're doing here, and then I cut it right here with the saw. I cut that bone, and I leave this whole as a roast. And so I have a really nice shoulder roast, and it's a great pot roast. Throw it in there with some carrot and celery and stuff in the bottom of the pan. Put this on, season it with a little salt, pepper, even a packet of the au jus stuff like you'd use for a French dip. Put a cup of wine in there, seal that with aluminum foil, put it in the oven at 200 degrees for about 8 hours, and it falls off the bone, and it's really, really good. And we're going to trim this one out just so you can see how to trim it. All right, so now if you look on this shoulder, you can see how this bone comes down through here. And so again, we're just going to follow the seam, and you're going to cut right onto that shoulder blade. Bring this up, and then you're just following the bone contour again. Just keep the tip of your knife in contact with that bone, and you're just like you're filleting a fish. You're just working that down. And this is your flat iron steak that we talked about. So obviously on a bigger animal, this is going to be a lot bigger. And you can see it's got this tendon that runs down through it. So that you want to fillet that out to remove it. This makes great fajita, you know, again, or stir fry. It's the most tender cut on the front shoulder. So on the other side of that bone is the mock tender, and I like to cut this into like little breakfast steaks, medallions. We've got our shoulder clod here, and it's connected up, but it's kind of a tough, well, it's not tough, but I mean it's a semi tender cut of meat. And this is again good for stew, stir fry. And then you have your hot ham or your shank here. Again, very, very tough cut of meat, full of the tendons and stuff. Very used muscle on deer and elk and stuff. That's why it's such a tough cut. But again, it has the most flavor because you have all of the tendons and stuff in there, and when it's slow cooked, all of that releases into the soup and stews and stuff that you make with it. So again, you're just following the bone and trimming that out. And that's your front shoulder. So, you know, I always consider it's lucky when you have an intact shoulder, but a lot of times you're going to have some bone fragment stuff when you start cleaning these up. So again, I cut this right here. It'd be trimmed up, and this makes a really great roast. But you've got your flat iron steak, which is again the most tender part of the front shoulder, your little eye of the round mock tender, and your shank meat, which is your most toughest but flavorful. And then you have the clod that is semi-tender. We would trim some of this up and that. And again, you can make burger, or you could do a little roast with that, or chili. It makes really good chili. And so that would be that front shoulder.